wanted to show another enhancement to Illuminated Cloud that allows you to work with what are affectionately known as Salesforce DX develop against any org projects, which basically means that you have the benefits of Salesforce DX in terms of the source form in which your project metadata is laid out. It gives you more flexibility in terms of how you structure it, metadata decomposition so that composite metadata types like custom object metadata and workflows and things like that are broken out into the constituent pieces. But it allows you to do so against non-Scratch orgs. And so Illuminated Cloud now has support for that, currently in beta form, linked to the associated ticket in the issue tracker, but probably within the next week or so, it'll be folded into the main product. So let's just take a look. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, and I'm going to do it, in this case, just against an org, but you could create it from version control if you want. Illuminated Cloud will recognize the shape of the project and automatically convert it as appropriate. But in this case, I'm just going to choose Illuminated Cloud SFDX. We'll go ahead and call this IC any org. And the important thing is to check generate manifest. If you don't, it becomes a Scratch org project. If you do, it tells the Salesforce DX CLI to create the project with a package XML file that you'll use to deploy and retrieve your metadata using force source deploy and force source retrieve. So we'll go ahead and say next. Everything looks good here. And we'll say finish, and it will use the CLI to create that project. Of course, IC is driving it. And as soon as that's done, I will go ahead and open the project in IC, and we'll add a project or add a connection to it and such. All right, so it's open, and it says I can now choose an existing org or authorize a new org. And that's an important distinction because if we create a new org here, we can choose an existing one, and these were all authenticated using OAuth web login flow, and I've shown that in another video that I just released. But I can also just say I want to create a new connection, and notice that I'm not filling out credentials here, and I'm also not filling out the Scratch org config dialog. All I need to do is give it an alias and say what the login URL is, and it will use web login flow to authorize that org. So in this case, I've already shown that in another video, so we'll just choose an existing org that I've authorized using Salesforce DX. And so now it's going to generate the offline symbol table. And while it's doing so, let me explain some of the characteristics of this project and how it relates to the other two traditional project types. So a develop against any org project in Illuminated Cloud is going to work more like a traditional Illuminated Cloud project against a configured connection. So deployment and retrieval are going to allow more fine-grained selection of the metadata that you want. You will be able to do things like conflict detection and things like that in a more explicit way than you would have been able to using Salesforce DX Scratch org, where the CLI is responsible for push and pull. The OST has been generated, so I'm just going to let it index and reopen, and we'll look at how we can pull and push metadata and things like that, or in this case, retrieve and deploy metadata. But it gives you the ability to work with the metadata in that nice new source form that the Salesforce DX CLI gives you when you're working with Scratch orgs, and that Illuminated Cloud also gives you the benefit of that. So if we take a look, we'll see that there is no metadata here. It hasn't actually performed a retrieve yet. It did stub out a couple of directories, and it gave me a package XML that is my metadata subscription. That's an important thing, is these projects are always based on package XML. There's no way to do an explicit selection type of metadata subscription. So why don't we go ahead and do a retrieve, and it's going to retrieve based on the current subscription, and it will open up the same retrieve dialog that you're accustomed to if you've worked with Illuminated Cloud against non-Scratch orgs, against DE orgs, sandboxes, production orgs, things like that. And you can see that everything's on the server only right now. So let's just go ahead and do a retrieve. One thing that you may notice is retrieve from merge is not here. So while it's doing the retrieve, I'll talk through that. The CLI is responsible for doing this using force source retrieve, and I cannot tell the CLI where to retrieve the metadata. It retrieves it directly into the project. So there's no opportunity right now for Illuminated Cloud to pull it into a temporary directory so that you can rationalize what came down in the retrieve operation against what you have in your local project. I have some thoughts on how to bridge that gap, and in fact, Salesforce made allow us to do it by adding pre and post hooks to retrieve, deploy, push, pull. I'm going to chat with them about that before I implement anything special. But right now, retrieve for merge is disabled for these types of projects. So retrieve the metadata. You can see that we have classes here. Shopping list mobile view controller is one of the classes that I have in here. I can open it up. Everything's there as you would expect. So what happens if we want to retrieve more metadata? So Lightning Web Components is empty. It was stubbed out when we created the project. Why don't we go ahead and pull those down? So again, this is a package XML based metadata subscription. So I will just say Lightning component bundle and add that, and we'll do another retrieve. And what it's going to show is it's going to show all the things that we have, local plus server, and you'll see down here that now that I've updated that, it shows Lightning Web Components. So in this case, to make it a more efficient retrieve, I'm just going to uncheck local plus server and click retrieve. And so it's going to pull those down, and the static resources it was showing, I believe, are due to the fact that it's not recognizing the explosion of archive type resources, of resource bundles by the CLI. Probably a bug. Again, this is in beta. I'll get that resolved before it goes out. But anyway, so it's retrieving that metadata, and in just a moment we should see that we have Lightning Web Components as part of our local project, and in fact we do. So here we have those, and if we want to see what just happened, by the way, you can just go to the messages view, and it shows you, in this case, the LWCs shows them actually as unchanged, which is kind of strange, but that's what's coming down from the CLI. In fact, they were added. I'm not sure why it's posting that as a status, but the Lightning Web Components are now available as part of the project, and you can work with them. What if we wanted to retrieve something and we either weren't familiar with the metadata type name to update the package XML, or perhaps it's something that doesn't allow wildcarding and we wanted to, obviously add explicit members? Well, let's do another retrieve, and we'll change it to custom, and we will turn off subscribed only, so that now it's showing me things I'm not currently subscribed to. And let's go down to objects, because I want to get some custom objects I don't have yet, and not necessarily grab custom objects or standard objects that I don't want. So I will explicitly select my expense objects and my shopping list objects, and I'll do a retrieve, and it will retrieve those into the local project. And importantly, it will also apply metadata decomposition to them. So as soon as that's retrieved, we'll take a look at what was retrieved, and we'll take a look at the actual form of it on disk. And of course, this is one of the benefits. I'm not working against a scratch org, but I'm getting the benefit of source form and metadata decomposition. So it retrieved those, and I can see that it retrieved the objects, but I can also see, and it's funny, it's saying unchanged again. I'll report that to Salesforce, all the fields and such. But if we take a look at the objects, we can now see that they're decomposed. And in fact, if we wanted to, we could go make a change to one of these and show how we could deploy back. So let's go to the end of this, and I'll change this to expense name 2 and deploy on save. So I'm just going to hit Control S, and you can see that it's deploying. In this case, it is using the CLI to deploy it. It's using force source deploy. I will show you something in just a moment about Illuminated Cloud's support for these types of projects, and the fact that it can still use the tooling API for potentially faster deployment of things when that's supported. And so that deployed about 16 seconds. And so why don't we move over to Shopping List Mobile View Controller, and I will change this. And I will show you real quick that under validation deployment that we're using the tooling API for these metadata types that are supported. And I'm going to hit Control S, and it's going to use the tooling API, and it should deploy in just a couple of seconds. So yeah, two and a half seconds or so. And just to show the difference, if I turn that off and come back over and change it again and save, let's see how long this takes. This is somewhat of a dice roll. I don't know how long it'll take because it depends upon how the queues are, but in general, the tooling API, which is also queue-based for Apex and Visualforce, tends to be quite a bit faster. It's just not competing for queue length against so many other metadata types that get deployed, and things like automated deploys that always use the metadata API. So it was 16 seconds, so quite a bit longer. Again, that may vary throughout the day, but I found that the benefit of using the metadata or the tooling API over the metadata API can tend to be pretty profound. And again, 2.5 seconds when I changed it back. So that's actually kind of nice. And similarly, if we come back over, errors are exposed. If we just change this to name field X, which of course the IDE is flagging as invalid, but change that to name field X and try to deploy, you'll see how errors get reported to the end user in just a moment when this completes, and how you can then use the error reporting in order to resolve resolve the issue hopefully pretty easily. So in this case, under the messages view, it shows us and it links directly to it. And additionally, under the problems view, we get the exact same thing. So I'll just change that back. So you can get an idea of deployment, retrieval. They work very similar to what you're accustomed to. If I come over here to ShopList Mobile View Controller and change this so that I remove that and go into retrieve and change to context and of course say local server and subscribed only. I can also diff against the server from here and it will retrieve the version from the server into a temporary directory. This is a little different from retrieve from merge because it's not intended to be used on a wholesale project basis. This is just so you can take a look at things relative to server in a one by one. And we can see here, and it's also really only going to work well for metadata types that are not decomposed metadata types. And we can see that there's a difference between local and the server. Okay, so you get an idea of the things that work and things that don't. And again, these connections, these OAuth connections, if we take a look at the one I used, they are just connections that show up. The things that you can't configure, like credentials, because it's OAuth, are disabled. But I can set the API version. I can turn on conflict detection, which, by the way, is not wired in yet. It will be before this is released in an official build. But right now, it's not wired in. But you can turn it on for either of the supported mechanisms, and really any of the other features here for connections, and take advantage of those. So that's kind of an overview of what's available here with developing against any org using Salesforce DX in Illuminated Cloud. So it'll automatically recognize these projects. They can coexist right beside projects that are traditional metadata API projects or Scratch org projects, although that would be kind of a contrived situation to have all three of those in a single workspace or a single IntelliJ IDEA or WebStorm project. And for the most part, they work exactly like you're accustomed to, with the same kind of fine-grained ability to move metadata back and forth, and some benefits of being able to use the tooling API when that deployment path is available while you're working. So this will be released. My guess is within a week, maybe a week and a half. I've got the beta out there. I just want to make sure that there's significant burn-in time so that I don't disrupt anybody using the product due to a regression that might be introduced. I'm actually using this myself as my daily driver right now to assist with that burn-in. Hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to send me over any questions, and thanks for your time.